Welcome. Today is our February version of the RCOP meeting, and we're really excited because today we get to learn more about the rulemaking process and what opportunities exist in the space. Our guest speaker will be Jacob Horne. Better introduction coming in a second or two. Hi, Jay. First, wanted to mention, as always, what is RCOP? And that's Regulated Research Community of Practice. We are higher ed institutions helping each other out and trying to run our regulated research programs. We currently have about 285 institutions, and we have maybe 8 countries represented. This is an NSF award, and we're in year 2 of that. Couple of things to give plugs for were the EDUCAUSE, CCC, PPC. Yeah, we're running with a day with the assessors, and that will be a full day workshop. Registration is live. There's CUICon coming up in Orlando. There's CIC in San Diego, and I saw that there was a discount for higher ed people, so use that if you can. And then we also have the 4th annual NIST conference for securing HPC systems. As a brief item, that last month we held our second birthday party, which is essentially our stakeholder advisory board. So we were chatting through some of the stats that have made us who we are. We have over 6,000 hours of community attendance to our events, and things that we talked about were pretty much how to package packaging our results for the broader impact statements. And that was around how to craft our metrics around can we make action from that, as well as what partnerships should we explore for advocacy. And advocacy comes up again. It's been asked from me of what's kind of going through my head and what's driving some of my directives recently. And that's, as we've entered the 3rd year of this, I kind of am looking at it going, okay, we've built a strong community. We've built some amazing resources for ourselves. But one thing that we are lacking in is how to advocate and share our needs out to the communities that can help us. And where I go in further into that is there are plenty of groups and organizations that are dedicated to promoting the use cases that they know of. And I'm realizing over time that we haven't done a great job at positioning ourselves for making that super easy for someone to run with. And while this screen talks about mostly advocacy groups, the same also applies in terms of our CMMC assessors and the use cases that they should start understanding that why does this look a little bit different than maybe their standard assessments. So that's been what's rolling around in my head. And I've just recently started this weekend with kind of trying to bring together some of our stories into small narrative bites that we can start handing out to people who want to do this and have them help us in terms of this space. So I guess the reason I give that type of information is this is really the start of let's start advocating more for what our world looks like. And that ties into why today is a really valuable talk. So hopefully this is the start of lots more advocation. And Jay?
Thanks. Just as kind of an introduction, Jacob, more for your benefit, to give you a little bit of a backstory of who we're about. It's a community that relies a lot on asking, how are you handling X questions of each other and sharing in that way? But one of the other things we do is, hey, did you see Y heads up alerts? And so it's in that vein that your name has become synonymous with, hey, have you seen what Jacob posted on this, that, or the other? So for good or bad, you have definitely become one of our go-to resources, and especially for folks like myself who don't relish digging into the documents and reading them in great detail. Having some colleagues in our community that do that well and having resources like yourself are extremely helpful. I wanted to set the stage to try and give you a sense, and I know you heard some of this when we were out in Denver and had an opportunity to speak out there about what makes the university research programs and this process a little different. Say from a small business in the DIB or even one of the large primes. I think, like the DIB, we have a broad spectrum in our community of what awareness is around what this whole CMMC process is. I think we have some who think that it's a cybersecurity thing. I think you see that reflected in our poll where we had the response being, 27% said, hey, this is the CISO's job, to a little bit more of awareness that it's actually a strategic planning consideration that needs to be made at the institutional level. And I think that's where you start to see, only 17% recognizing that this is something that needs to be at the VPR level, which is vice provost or vice president for research. Another thing that tends, though, to make us different, and one of the things I think we want to kick off today is how do we work this difference into our responses in the request for comment, is our research portfolio is ever evolving. And unlike a business in the DIB, which is fairly narrowly defined, the university is more like a collection of those businesses, each putting in grants. And so we can't predict 12 months out what is going to be in our portfolio that needs to be covered, which makes that whole assessment on a 3-year cycle a bit tenuous because we don't know what the scope is going to be 6 months from now. We don't know what's going to be funded. And so even in our standard sit-alone enclave, the scope of things will vary for an enclave as you go from one project's workflow to another. And so we're grappling with how do we reflect that in. And then the other piece I think to throw into the mix is historically we come at this from being an open and fundamental research environment. That's our history. We have shared resources that we use. So, we have expensive equipment used by all at the university. We have universities that have actually built infrastructure in the last decade to reflect an open and collaborative environment. And that doesn't mesh very well with where we are. So with all of that, what are some of the things that we could possibly address via the request for comment to try and get some awareness around that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, thanks for having me. We talked about this at CS2 Denver. We don't have it on your event chart on that opening slide, Carolyn, but jumping ahead to the end, we're having CS2 in Boston the first week in April. I'll put the link here in chat. We also have a discount code for registration for anybody who's interested in attending. So you can feel free to use that. It's a hybrid event. So if you're local in the area, then we have the in-person event. If you're remote, then we also have the virtual attendance as well. So you should definitely check that out. And then Jay and Carolyn, I'll probably talk with you guys after we get done here because we still have, I think, 1 or 2 open agenda slots. So maybe based off what comes out of this meeting, out of the Q&A doc, we can tailor a specific session that this audience would find valuable. So CS2 is really trying to be a very broad approach to all these different topics. We talked about this in Denver. We've talked about this before individually. I am always struck by how the CUI program has evolved over time and how it's been so centralized around higher education challenges with the requirements and the data governance and everything like that. Yet most of the conversation has seemed to move on to impacts around small business rather than higher education institutions. And that's a relatively new trend in the rhetoric around just CUI requirements in general, when as we've talked about, so much of the data that is so many of the issues around the data are actually in academia rather than just in small business environments. As it just so happens, I was doing some research on the concept of fundamental research. And if you read the actual description of fundamental research, they cite this paper, this Corson panel paper from 1982. So I was reading that over the weekend, and it's just fascinating because all of the excerpts from this panel report from the 1980s could have been written yesterday. They were talking about, at that time, espionage and sensitive data leaking out of academic institutions as far as the Soviets were concerned. There's actually a section of that report that talks about how China isn't a concern because at that time it was still considered to be a third world country. So it's very, very interesting to read that report in light of what's going on today. I've got some abbreviated slides from a webinar that we gave in January covering the rule, but maybe just to jump to what you were asking, Jay, about things that pop up as highlights as far as comments go in the rule. There's only 12 days left on that comment period. So if you haven't started organizing your thoughts, now is a good time to do so. Okay, so the first one that jumps to my mind, and this will be in the slides. You can also find more details of this at the webinar recording that I'll post the link to, is section 170.19 of the proposed rule is called CMMC scoping. So much of this problem is driven by scoping at multiple levels. So the first aspect of scoping that people should be aware of is the usage of external service providers. And this isn't always a situation that includes external service providers like Summit 7, as in hiring some sort of MSP to facilitate the requirements and the IT administration inside of a lab or whatever the enclave environment happens to be inside of a specific part of the institution, because there's language in the rule that talks about internal providers of services. So almost an internal external service provider, if you will. It specifically says if the external service provider is internal to the organization seeking an assessment, the security requirements implemented by that external provider need to be listed in the SSP to show connection to its in-scope environment. So if you are inheriting the ability to satisfy these compliance requirements from other organizations inside the university, but outside of your specific enclave, you still need to treat them as though you were hiring Summit 7 or whoever as a private company to facilitate those requirements. So it isn't necessarily something that I think would change as a result of public comments, but it's something that people need to be aware of as far as scoping goes, because if you are inheriting something from big IT, sort of like campus-wide IT, you're still going to have to treat that, describe it, defend those answers during an assessment in the same way as if you were a private company hiring another private company to be your outsourced provider. So that's one that people should definitely be aware of. Another one that comes to mind, to your point, Jay, about fundamental research, there's one of the more interesting aspects of the CMMC proposed rule is that they provide answers to public comments that were submitted on the 2020 version of the CMMC rule. One, this is very interesting because that's typically not done until a final rule is published. So they are seemingly preempting public comments by publishing the responses to comments from 2020 on a proposed rule rather than on a final rule. We'll cover why that's important when we get to the timeline. But in response to public comments from academic institutions regarding fundamental research concerns and CMMC requirements, they give this long-winded sort of boilerplate answer. And at the end, they say, if DoD determines the information handled by contractors pursuant to the fundamental research contract activities is or will become FCI or CUI, the information would be required to be processed, stored, or transmitted on an information system compliant with the appropriate CMMC level. So this is going to throw a real wrench in the gears, basically exactly to what you were saying, Jay. Not only is it difficult for you to know what your scope happens to be, but DoD now has language in this response to public comments saying it doesn't even necessarily have to be FCI or CUI now. It could be fundamental research, which is inherently exempt from the requirements in DFARS 7012. But if we determine that it will eventually become FCI or CUI, then congratulations, you will be on the hook in the future. So I feel like that's probably something people should take a closer look at. It's not in the proposed text of the regulation itself. So the structure of the rule is a little confusing. There's about 150 pages of things in the rule that are not the regulation itself. It's not section 170.1.2.3, all that's like the bottom quarter of the rule. Everything else in the preamble, if you will, to the rule is basically black and white policy statements from the DoD, but it's not actually part of the regulation. So it definitely pays to pay attention to the details in the front matter of the rule and not just the text of the proposed regulation itself at the end. And that specific line that fundamental research could become CUI in the future, and if we determine that it might, then you have to have CMMC, seems like probably the red flag to everyone in this call as something that you want to comment on. How do you know if it's going to be CUI? Who determines if it's going to be CUI? How far ahead will you say that it will become CUI? Is there any limitation to your ability to say it will become CUI in 6, 12, 18 months, 3 years? How far ahead does it have to be possibly CUI for us to have to do CMMC now, right? So I think that's going
And
to
not
be...
to mention, I think to that point would be, and once you make that declaration, how much time are you going to give us to pivot to deal with it? Yeah.
Exactly. Now, one advantage here as far as scoping goes is, for the most part, and please correct me if I'm wrong, unlike small businesses in the DIB who do not have the ability to speak directly with their government customers because they're typically on the other side of large prime contractors, most research organizations that we've spoken to, at least, generally have a direct dialogue with their government customer. It doesn't tend to be sort of filtered through like a Raytheon or a Lockheed for the most part. In that situation where you have the ability to have a direct conversation with your customer, there's going to be a different DFARS clause that probably doesn't come up or hasn't come up. I've definitely never posted about it before. That's going to be directly relevant to everyone. And it's DFARS 252-204-7000. So this is the one at the very front of this cluster of cybersecurity clauses like 7012, 7019, 7020, 7021. DFARS 204-7000 talks about the disclosure of information. And there's a portion in that clause that says, let's see here, the contractor shall not release to anyone outside of the contractor's organization any unclassified information, regardless of medium, blah, 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 unless the contracting officer has given prior written approval or the information is otherwise in the public domain before the date of release, or, and this is the important part, the information results from or arises during the performance of a project that involves no covered defense information as defined in 7012 and has been scoped and negotiated by the contracting activity, that would be you guys, with the contractor and research performer and determined in writing by the contracting officer to be fundamental research. Long-winded way of saying all of these roads are going to go back to the contracting officer making the determination that this data would be fundamental research. This is in direct conflict in my reading with the language in the CMMC rule, in the sense that you are in agreement with the government per DFARS 7000 that we have this agreement with the contracting officer, with the research organization, with the government customer, that this is fundamental research. That's why we have these disclosure rules. This is why we can share information in an academic and scientific setting because of the language in 7000. Yet the CMMC rule says, well, if we just say that it's going to be not fundamental research in the future, you have to get a CMMC requirement, even though 7000 exempts you from the requirements in 7012. So I'll send the link to those in chat here when I get a second, but DFARS 7000 compared with that specific line in the proposed rule are maybe the crux of one of these issues, because the best bet that everybody has in this conversation is the data has to be categorized as fundamental research. And if it is, then the requirements don't apply. And if the requirements don't apply, then CMMC verification does not apply. And then all this sort of goes out the window. The second that we start to blur the lines around fundamental research or not, things start to get very, very complicated on top of the issues projecting and scoping and telling what funding is going to be like. Okay. Well, maybe we'll just stop there, see if anybody has questions about those two things. I'll send the links to them before we get into some slides.
Yeah, by all
Does that-
means, I know that you've touched on some things that several folks in our audience should have had their ears perk up on. So if you've got a question, just raise your hand and we'll peel them off. And I'll start with Lewis. I see your hand first.
Yeah, one of the things I'm wondering about is the 150 other pages that, are at the start of the regs. How do you see that playing out for those of us that are in the trenches? It sounds like, is it going to be up to the contracting officer to make all the decisions? Will there be guidance from the DoD to these contracting officers? And what will happen if there's a gap between what is in the actual regulations and what's in those other pages?
Yeah. Let me add this link here so people can read it. Okay. So you've got 7,000 and this sort of magical, mysterious, fundamental clause determination in the proposed rule, and those two links in chat there. Yeah. So as far as the differences go between that other set of 150 pages and what ends up in the final rule, it's kind of interesting. The last several years, basically all of my content has come from those other portions of the rules that have been written that are not the language directly in the clauses themselves. So today, if you were to go online and look up DFAR 7012, the only thing that you see are the 13 paragraphs in DFAR 7012. All the rationale and reasoning and compromise and explanation only exists in the published final rule in the Federal Register. And if you don't go through and read all several hundred pages of these previous rules, you don't sort of know why the government is saying what they're saying. As far as the CMMC rule goes, if you were to take it as it exists now, and then the final rule is published in the future, the only thing that you'll see is the language of the proposed regulation at 32 CFR section 170. You won't see any of this previous logic or explanation. Now, this makes it sort of awkward because it is true that this is how the government is thinking about it. And so that sort of reads on top of the language of the regulation what to expect. But when you read the regulation, none of that sort of human thought none of it sort of exists. So this is sort of a rambling way of saying it's very important to read those other 150 some odd pages beforehand, because when you read through just the text of the proposed regulation, there doesn't really seem to be an issue. They don't talk about fundamental research. It doesn't really come up. You just sort of assume, well, it seems like an open-ended question. Whereas this one line out of the thousands of lines in the rule says, we can just determine in the future that it's going to not be fundamental research. And that implies, well, how are you going to square that with DFAR's 7,000? So there's sort of a loose outline of what I would submit as a comment if I were at a higher education institution is, this is just a throwaway line seemingly in the rule. It's not even in the text of the regulation, yet this other rule that you established for this specific reason back in 2016 says you can't do that. What do the contracting officers have to say about this? Just to get back to CS2, which some of you have participated in CS2 beforehand, so it's pretty neutral ground. We're actually going to have a panel of former contracting officers at one of the sessions. So I'll be sure to add this specific item to that agenda, but if you're able to attend and submit your questions, they're the ones to ask the questions of, because ultimately they're the arbiters of all these decisions for what ends up happening with determinations like this.
Thanks. Jeff.
Jacob, I may be totally off base here, so feel free, please, to tell me that. But it's my sense in this determination about fundamental research that supersedes NARA's authority to determine what is and what is not CUI in the first place. And perhaps that's just what we're seeing is right now an attempt to harmonize things amongst a lot of disharmony between competing rules and regulations. Do you have a sense that would be a good argument in a public comment that one might make from one's institution, or do you think that's a separate line of authority? Because it seems to me, at least at a high level, like NARA gets to make the determination, and this really is undermining their authority there, and that seems really problematic.
So I'll add a link here in chat to the 2016 NARA rule that establishes the federal CUI program. I don't believe that they're in conflict, and I don't think NARA will say they're in conflict either, because the designation of fundamental research preempts any categorization of CUI. If something is fundamental research, it is inherently not CUI. Where it breaks down is when contracting officers, program managers, other DoD customers get lazy, which they often do, and they just say it's all CUI. They sort of reflexively default to saying things are CUI. What NARA will say is that's not NARA's problem, right? That's them being lazy. They even say it in this 2016 rule when, honestly, most of the public comments came from higher education institutions. In 2016, they said, we don't contemplate the idea that data is unmarked, that data is overmarked. We don't contemplate the idea that there are issues where it's not operating in a sort of, everyone's not a perfectly rational, self-interested entity in the data protection ecosystem here. So what NARA would tell you is, if it's fundamental research, it's not CUI. And therefore, if it's not CUI, none of this other stuff applies. But that's why it's so important to sort of push back on little gotchas like this in the rule, and specifically on the contracting officers to say, listen, these are different things, and you guys are blurring the lines here. And when you do that, it causes a lot of issues. I think that there's, I still need to do my background reading, but this problem of fundamental research goes way, way, way back. I mean, this goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, when they started to have panels and committees and like some pretty heavy duty research into this problem. And the reason that the concept of fundamental research is documented the way that it is were the findings of those panels and committees in the 70s and 80s. So NARA coming along and sort of cleaning up all these disparate markings and protection strategies and things like that is not superseding the CUI program. They would tell you the designation as fundamental research has existed for a long time. So we're not rocking the boat here. That kind of falls apart when contracting officers and PMs get lazy. But similar to other organizations in the DIB, it's pretty unfair because this puts the pressure on you to push back on them to do the thing that they were supposed to be doing all along. And there's nobody really driving the ship because NARA says it's not really our problem. You talk to the KOs and they go, well, we're really busy. We got other stuff going on. It's not an ideal situation, but I would not say that it's a conflict between NARA and anything like that.
I guess I was seeing it as kind of an undermining of it's not CUI effectively because of this designation, but maybe the right way to approach it is to say there needs to be a procedure that establishes rigor, and that's really the comment. Do the diligence on the contracting side to make sure you're not overly applying the CUI label to work that's not subject to it.
Well, I'll say two things on this. One is I've got a chart here that we can go over in a minute because the DFAR 7012 rule is going to be revised this year. It'll be published as a proposed rule, and that will be the place to really focus public comments on what is the role of DFAR 7000 in terms of contract officer designations for fundamental research. What is the expansion or clarification or extra granular detail on handling fundamental research designations per 7012, because everything else sort of orbits around what 7012 does. The other point here is NARA's kind of been asleep at the wheel for a while, right? As far as like undermining their authority, if you've been paying attention to the revision process for NIST SP 800-171 revision 3, you'll know that they're changing the formatting of the controls to make the organizationally defined parameters, essentially the variable values that go into the control text themselves, like how often do you test your incident response plan? How often, how long do you give somebody before their account is frozen? These sort of variable values. If you have a minimum baseline that's supposed to be the same identical baseline for all forms of CUI across the federal ecosystem and their suppliers, and everyone gets to define those values separately, you don't have a minimum baseline. You've got a million different baselines because those values aren't the same. So NARA saying we're the CUI executive agent, we're the ones that get to determine ultimately what that minimum baseline looks like, of sort of absconding their responsibility and just allowing the agencies to define these values independently is a definite undermining of their authority. And they don't have seemed to have noticed. I guess they have other things going on. So yeah, maybe that, maybe you can make the case that it's sort of stepping on NARA's toes in various ways, but I don't know where NARA's been for the last couple of years. They don't seem to be too upset about what's going on. So I don't necessarily think that they're going to swoop in from the sidelines and sort of shake everybody awake.
All right, I'm going to take one more question here before we pivot a bit, but and I call this person by name, but since all I've got is a big long acronym sitting in front of us, if you've got a question, go ahead and ask it, please.
My question is sort of related to a comment too. I'm on the contract side, and we deal with the 252, 204, 7000 clause on a pretty regular basis. It can be directly provided to us and a direct to us from DoD, or it can be subcontracted to us. If it's direct to us, then it applies to us. If it's subcontracted to us, then we have the option of using the A3 to have it removed from us, and our part of the project as a university is determined to be fundamental research. I was looking at the proposed rule and I ran across that language, and it surprised me because it was unclear to me. Are they saying that they can say something that is currently fundamental research becomes CUI? That can't happen because you've already released it. It's out there in the open at that point.
Right.
Or are they saying that you can have CUI in a fundamental research project, which is contrary to the actual 252, 204, 7000 clause, because it says if you have CUI, it's not fundamental research. So it was unclear to me what they were trying to get across in that particular language.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in the rule, obviously, so I don't want to be overly simplistic with what's going on. But if you have been busy and there's only 12 days left in the comment period, and there was one thing that I think that the higher education community should focus on, it's probably that line, is we can just say something is CUI even though we've already said it's fundamental research, which seems to violate like 45 years of how fundamental research is supposed to work. That definitely needs to be either eliminated or clarified to a greater degree, for sure.
I think this kind of ties in with another thing that when Carolyn and I were talking about this is, in addition to this fundamental research, and I've seen a contract within the last year where they talked about, it has the possibility in year 2 or 3 to become CUI, depending on what you do in this stage, is this whole concept, and you've mentioned it recently, of the overmarking, undermarking concerns. And I think most of us would agree that rarely do we get a contract that spells out exactly what the CUI is, which makes scoping it all the more difficult. And where do we put in the comments of DoD, please keep your side of this and play by the rules too, because you're not playing by the rules is making it very difficult for us to play by them.
Well, okay, so I 100% agree that that's the reality on the ground. What I will say is I have a feeling the way that DoD is going to respond to that theme of comments is they're going to mostly be dismissive of it, not because it's an issue, but because of the fact that the CMMC program office is not the program office that is in charge of the DoD's CUI program. And so we end up in this like pointing Spider-Man meme house of mirrors where the ANS acquisition and sustainment office is in charge of part of this problem. The CMMC PMO is in charge of part of this problem. Defense pricing and contracting is in charge of the 7012 part of the problem. And then, the INS office in the Pentagon is in charge of the CUI program itself. And so it's heavily dependent. And what ends up happening is CMMC exposes these problems, and then everybody submits the comments on the CMMC rule. And it isn't necessarily even within the ability of the CMMC office that's running the rule to change anything, right? So out of principle, probably submit those comments for sure. I don't know how effective it will be at influencing any particular change in the text of the CMMC proposed regulation. I'm not really sure where the opportunity will come up over the next year to have those issues found out. Like, for instance, you guys have seen me post about that CUI DoD IG report that came out last year. So they have it documented as a problem. I don't know what the status of that follow-up is, but I'd say it's probably the most common comment other than cost on the CMMC rule. And like the cost comments, the DoD is mostly going to go, that's not really in our wheelhouse, unfortunately. So I know it's not a very reassuring answer, but I just feel like that's what they're going to do, is they're going to say, yeah, CUI marking, under marking, whatever that problem happens to be, you got to go down the hall and talk to those guys. But you can't get a hold of them. They're not issuing any rules. So what are we supposed to do here? So it's not completely futile, I think, to submit those comments, but I would temper expectations about what sort of change is going to occur. It's sort of like the funding appropriation issue, right? Lots of the public comments submitted so far say, well, there should be a funding appropriation. The CMMC PMO office will say, yeah, there should be. You should talk to the appropriators because that would be wonderful. And they're not in charge of any sort of appropriation for helping with these requirements. So it's a good comment, but in the context of who's reading the comments and what they can do, I just don't know how much it can actually change.
I think that's a fair assessment. Say it and don't hold your breath waiting for change.
Yeah, keep them in your back pocket, so you can drop them whenever the right opportunity comes up. But I don't know, this isn't the right opportunity. I'm not sure what the opportunity is that will be that leverage point over the CUI problem. It is a real problem, but it's tough. It's tough.
Being mindful of the time, I know you said you had a few slides that you wanted to share, so maybe we should
let me hop into these real fast, and then that might answer these two questions. Okay. And then we'll get through those. Let's see here. All right, is everybody able to see that timeline slide here?
Yep.
Okay, so I just wanted to cover these really quickly because the main concept that I want everybody to remember is that all of the timelines and estimates in the proposed rule are based off of the 48 CFR CMMC rule. That's the one that will revise the DFAR 7021 clause that goes into contracts and agreements. But that is not the rule that was published at the end of December. The rule that was published at the end of December is the 32 CFR rule. And that's the one that codifies the overall CMMC program, sort of how the program will be governed and will operate. And there will end up being a gap between those two rules, which will only add to the fun that we're all having. Currently on the timeline, we're almost done with the public comment period here in February. Historically, on average, it takes them roughly 280 business days to adjudicate all of those comments. That's based off our analysis of all the rules that they have submitted as proposed rules and then published as final rules since 2009. So this, based off of some other red tape that has to happen at the end, means that we would expect to see this final rule sometime in Q1, maybe April of 2025. So not very far away. Like I said before, there's two rules that correspond to the CMMC program. There's the program rule, 32 CFR, and the clause rule, 48 CFR. They both have to happen through this rulemaking process. But that gap is going to cause an issue, especially in industry, because DoD will say, we haven't started inserting the requirement into contracts at all, but when the 32 CFR rule is final, the market forces are sort of free to do what they do. Primes can pressure people to go get their certifications. People's competitors can say, we're going to go get certifications. It's going to cause a lot of second order problems that the DoD has no direct control over. So it's definitely something to be aware of. We've talked about this before on sort of other presentations. The average implementation timeline for 171 Rev 2 for small businesses who are not using enclave solutions can be anywhere from 12 to 18 months. This is typically not a technological constraint as much as it is readiness for technology transformation, compliance transformation, to sort of the organizational culture of being ready for this sort of a change. And that causes a big problem because if you fast forward to where we are in this timeline, depending on when people start their implementation, they're going to be in hot water. Typically, when we work with higher education institutions, we end up seeing people go with purely enclave environments. We're starting to see some of the larger research institutions set up like several different enclave environments altogether, just because of the issues that come with sharing the information, depending on nationality of researchers, certain constraints, just depending on what the situation tends to be. Unlike some small businesses in the DIB, the university can't sort of scope the entire university network into compliance by any means. So you end up having to juggle multiple enclave solutions together. And then just you can sort of slide this this implementation window around to see the situation that starts to arise depending on when people start that implementation. For the most part, with a enclave style solution, that implementation window is maybe several months rather than a year to a year and a half. It's still a significant amount of time, but it doesn't take quite as long. Either way, there's still not that much time before things start to go live with the CMMC rule here. So it's something to keep in mind. One thing that I do want to bring up, though, and this is mostly speculative, but I think there's a case for it. There are several reasons to believe that the DoD is going to be able to get the final rule out this year rather than in Q1 of next year. And the reason why I think that that's true is, one, they're going to be incredibly motivated to get done before the election, because a new administration and a new Congress adds a lot of extra time to that red tape on the end of the rule once it's published. So that would probably extend it maybe towards Q1 or Q2 rather than Q1 of 2025. There's also several things that they've done with the rule, like putting their public comment responses into the proposed rule rather than waiting for the final rule, as well as sending the rule to the Small Business Administration prior to publishing it publicly, which is not typically something that they do. Seems to be another preemptive move to get in front of public comments for small business impact. Recently, several organizations submitted comments asking for an extension to the public comment period, which DoD rejected. The official statement that they gave said they're not going to be extending the public comment period, and they've already started adjudicating the comments that have been submitted on a rolling basis rather than waiting for all the comments to come in at the end of the comment period, and that they would be moving on to the next steps after that adjudication as quickly as possible. You throw on top of that the fact that the overall number of comments is significantly lower than it was in 2020. As of right now, obviously there will be an increase in comments in the last week or two. But as of right now, I think there's not even 250 total comments from the 160 some odd comment submissions that have been made. For reference, there were 750 comments in 2020 from roughly the same number of total comment submissions. So not only do they have a lower number of comments to deal with, and they preempted those comments, but they're also rejecting any timeline extensions. The last reason to think that they might be able to move faster is something called midnight rulemaking, which has been documented by GAO sort of back through several administrations. More rules are released in the last year of an administration than any other time during an administration. This is sort of a well-documented trend. Combining that with the fact that DoD is going to be highly motivated to get their rule done anyways, I just think that there's a lot of reason to believe that they could go a few months faster than average. So depending on what you guys are looking at in terms of your conversations with your contracting officers, conversations with whatever the officials are in your organization who are responsible for these decisions, implementation timelines, I wouldn't guarantee that it's going to be this year, but have that cone of uncertainty included in the, have it include the end of 2024, not just automatically in the beginning of 2025. I just think there's a very strong case to make here for what's going on. Okay, let's see here. I have this red mark. Sorry about that, but we'll be able to provide these slides that weren't in that webinar to everybody afterwards. Okay, so just very quickly to catch everybody up, and then we get back to some questions. Looking forward through the rest of the year, there are several other events that are going to happen that are all relevant to this conversation. I don't know what the participation rate of higher education institutions is in the DIB-CS program, but they have expanded the eligibility of the DIB-CS program beyond just cleared defense contractors. The value of the DIB-CS program as an information sharing, threat intel sharing program, I think is debatable. However, it's one of the talking points that DoD has for saying we're making this easier on people who need to comply because we're taking this decade-long program and expanding eligibility and participation in it. And that's probably good enough in a 5-minute questioning session of, some congressional hearing somewhere to sound like it's a very valuable thing that they're doing. 800-171 is being revised to revision 3. This is not necessarily a CMMC problem. However, as I'm sure some of you are aware, the CMMC rule says you'll be assessed against 800-171 revision 2. DFAR 7012 says you're assessed, or you need to implement the most current version of 800-171. So as of May, late spring, per NIST in their latest webinar, that new revision will be out on the street, final, set in stone. And DFAR 7012 currently says you need to implement the most current version. So how are they going to square those two problems? Well, you have to implement the newest version of 171 Rev 3, but then get assessed against an older baseline that's no longer valid. Nobody really knows, but it's something to pay attention to. For those of you that are not aware, the delta from revision 2, the current set, to revision 3, the one that we expect in late spring, is roughly about a 30% increase in the total number of requirements. Like we talked about earlier, the second CMMC rule, the clause rule, the one that will revise DFAR 7021, will also come out sometime this year. I expect that will be sometime around summer. The official estimate was sometime in March, but it has not gotten out of the internal draft phase yet. It still has to go to OIRA review, still has to go through all that red tape. So I would imagine we wouldn't see that clause rule until sometime in summer, which is going to create that gap, like I talked about, between market rollout and the DoD's quote unquote phased rollout that they talk about in the rule. So there's going to be a gap between when assessments are available and people start pressuring you to get the cert, and when DoD actually officially says we're requiring the cert, which is going to be a really fun dynamic. Okay, the 32 CFR final rule, so the final version of the one that we're currently talking about, the final version of the one that came out on Christmas, I expect that that could happen as early as late summer, early fall, before the election. Historical data suggests that it would be Q1 of next year, but just be aware it could happen sooner rather than later for the reasons that we talked about earlier. Additionally, 800-172 is being revised. This is for anybody that's dealing with CMMC level 3 requirements. I'm sure that some of you are probably working on some pretty high speed stuff, depending on the nature of your research, that could easily tip into requiring CMMC level 3. The thing to note about CMMC level 3, 800-172, it is not gated by a maximum set of possible controls. NIST is able to pull from any of the controls in the larger 853 catalog. So this can be very esoteric and very expensive depending on how they decide to change it. Their estimate is that the final revision will be out sometime at the end of this year. We also talked about how the DFAR 7012 rule is going to be revised. That's really going to be the part where if you have specific comments on DFAR 7000, the cost of 800-171, fundamental research specifics, that's going to be the real leverage point for submitting comments when it comes to those things. Not that you shouldn't submit them on the CMMC rule, obviously, because there's lines in the rule that are relevant, but changes to DFAR 7000, changes to designations of fundamental research, explanations of cost, and things like that are a 7012 domain. I expect that rule will probably be published sometime after the summer. It could be earlier than that, but like I said, it's not the CMMC office that's in charge of this rule. It's actually a different part of the Pentagon that's in charge of publishing this rule. They're much less talkative. They're much less fun. So I don't think that they're going to get that done before the summer doldrums set in DC. Maybe it'll be another Christmas present, but be aware that that's going to happen sometime this year. And then the sort of white whale of this entire conversation around CUI is the FAR CUI rule. So this is the federal wide acquisition rule for CUI. This is the clause that would go in all federal contracts that say that all forms of CUI have to be protected with the 800-171 requirements. We've been waiting on this rule now since 2016. It is the third missing piece of the federal-wide CUI program. This matters because there are forms of CUI that are relevant to universities outside of DoD research information, like privacy information, student information, health information. There are several categories of CUI that will implicate the overall university in these requirements that are probably completely unaware of the fact that this exists. So it's maybe something to bring up, especially for all of you who, the 27% of you who the CISO is in charge of CUI, maybe let them know that this isn't just something that the DoD research organizations inside the university need to worry about. They need to come up with a plan for implementing 800-171 compliant environments for any form of CUI that they happen to have when this FAR CUI rule comes out. We don't know exactly when that will be. I expect it will be sometime this year. The way to think about this is imagine all of the pain points and complexities and burdens of the DoD DFAR 7012 world expanded onto any form of federal information that flows into universities that happens to be a category of information. This is no longer a fundamental research problem. These are just other forms of protected information. Same set of 800-171 requirements. So all of the trailblazing that everybody's doing here for your organizations is going to be even more important as those requirements spill over into the rest of your larger universities.
And I think that's one of the places where the question we've had, and suddenly now it's becoming not just higher ed research, as you noted, it's every university, every small college, and the question becomes, is everybody going to have their own version of a CMMC compliance requirement on top of that 800-171? Because that could be a real make or break when you look at something like federal financial aid, which means that no school would be immune to the impact of this.
Yeah, the DoD problem with CMMC is a moderately sized meteor. The FAR CUI rule and the implications for the universities is a really, really big meteor because most of those like other federal supply chains and suppliers, other parts of your university are probably completely oblivious to the fact that this is occurring or why it's important. And they're the most vulnerable to being impacted by that rule. And the irony here is that's the way that it was supposed to have been all along. The DoD actually started their DFARS rulemaking and all of this craziness because they couldn't wait for the FAR CUI rule any longer. They even say this in the 7012 rule back in 2016, that it was essentially a placeholder while they were waiting for the FAR CUI rule to come out, but they couldn't wait because they were losing all of the sensitive data. And that as soon as the FAR CUI rule is published, they would update their language to point to the superseding FAR regulation. So if you ask most people in the CMMC ecosystem, they don't even know the FAR CUI rule is supposed to exist. So that's a fun boogeyman on the horizon here.
Because we just needed another one.
Yeah.
Darren, you've been waiting patiently. So go ahead. Let's hear your question because I know we're getting into the last minutes here.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Jacob. You might have already answered my question in those last few minutes, but like you said, I waited that long and I was going to follow through hell or high water. So it was out of left field question. A couple of federal organizations I've had interaction with in the last couple of weeks, the National Reconnaissance Office and the Department of Energy. Now, there are those and several other federal organizations that don't use the DFARS clauses, but they have their own style and their own contract requirements that talk about cybersecurity and dissemination requirements for their data. And my question was going to be, do you have any indication that other federal agencies today that do not use the DFARS clauses to enforce NIST compliance may pick up the CMMC football and apply it to their own research data?
Yes. So a couple of reasons. One, I'll see if I can find the link. We covered it on a podcast probably, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, where I think GAO did an audit of the NNSA, National Nuclear Security Agency. And in their conversation about how they just had no visibility into supply chain security, the folks at the NNSA said, no, we have a memo that we're waiting on that will require CMMC certifications for our suppliers. We're just waiting on the CMMC rule to be final before we publish the memo, which is just a line in some random GAO report. And I was like, this is crazy because they're saying, yeah, as soon as it's done, we'll just require people to do it. I think that just putting your normal person hat on, knowing the government and knowing humans, we're talking about the same set of minimum requirements, and agencies and regulatory entities are having a lot of trouble forcing people to implement security and forcing people to be able to provide assurance over their data, their requirements, their infrastructure, whatever. And the CUI program is just sort of sitting there as a longstanding, well-established, government-wide thing, and all they have to do is just say, go use this existing program that's gone through rulemaking that already exists. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to come up with it. We don't have to go through rulemaking. We don't have to take the flack that DoD has taken. We're all amongst friends here. So, sort of unpublished, unofficial information, didn't hear it from me. There are rumors that there are several agencies that have a memo that's going to come out sort of endorsing the CMMC approach as a sort of universal approach to these minimum standards. I just think that they're going to get forced into doing that because they're having so much trouble either asking people nicely to do it or pursuing other authorities to force people to pursue it. When it comes to, well, especially when it comes to NRO, given my background with them at some of the primes that I worked at, they're a real wild card. If anybody's worked with them, you'll know. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't predict what they're going to do because they seem to do whatever they want to. But when it comes to intelligence community entities, they seem to kind of turn on a dime where they're like, no, we're too cool. We're too cool. We have too much stuff to do. Something will happen and they'll turn around and they'll say, why aren't you compliant yet? And you need to implement these requirements. I don't think that there may be some places to hide longer than others, but I don't think there's any place to hide permanently from these requirements creeping in through some sort of concocted formula that ends up implicating you.
Yeah, my intent wasn't looking for a place to hide. It was more of a starting to think of beyond what we're thinking about right now and projects that are going on that might not be considered that, but should be.
I would have a hard time imagining that the agencies aren't going to try to build off of what's already there rather than trying to engineer a solution from scratch. It's close enough to square peg round hole, so they're just going to probably pick it up and use it. There's a couple.
They already did the hard work, so
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a couple of examples of that already happening. Some public, some non-public. I would say that's probably more likely than not that it's going to happen.
Thank you, sir.
So being respectful of time, got to close this up. But yes, we probably easily could continue for another hour. We have so much questions. But thank you for showing us some of the boogeymen. We will get less sleep because of you. So thank you so much for coming and joining us today. And maybe we can continue these conversations in future settings too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, please. We have the links in chat, so I hope everybody was able to grab those. If not, I'll shoot those to you guys afterwards. Maybe you can send it out to your membership. The webinar is free. There's a discount code for CS2. If anybody has extra questions we didn't get to, if they're in the Q&A document, let's talk about it afterwards. Maybe we can follow up in a different session somewhere.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.